Hello, and welcome to Horrify, the channel of the damned. The damned gorgeous. So, today we will be looking at a horror writer whom some of you may have heard of, Stephen King. Now, Stephen King is a very, very prolific writer, as I'm sure you know. He produces a new book more or less every 4 or 5 days, I think. And so, due to the vast plethora of books that he has produced, it's very, very hard to come up with a definitive list. But I've put together my list of top 10 Stephen King books. Now, as with my list about the top 5 vampire books, this is my list now. Okay. And a list, it's very subjective. And a list can always change. A book that I might have on the list today might not be there tomorrow. And I'm sure it's the same for you. So this is my top 10 this is my choice for now. And it was pretty hard to choose top 10. I did think of doing top 10 novels and leaving aside his collections. But then I thought, no, I'll do his top 10 books because, then it's a bit more inclusive. I'm going to try to avoid any major spoilers. I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of each book. So there won't be my usual deep penetrating insight. There'll just be a brief penetrating insight. So number 10, we've got The Outsider. So this is a relatively recent King offering. And in brief, the story starts off with a man being accused of murdering a child. And all the evidence would seem to indicate that he's guilty, including DNA evidence. However, all the evidence would also seem to indicate that it couldn't have been him. So there's something of a quandary. And the book basically follows this individual's quest to prove his innocence when all the proof is against him. All the proof says that he did it. And basically, that's the protagonist. The antagonist is a killer with a very particular, we could say, ability. And this killer, and due to this ability, this killer is able to essentially go around killing willy-nilly. That's a very old expression, don't worry about it. I'm 51. And always get away with it. And so that's the basic kind of summary of the story. I like this book because it's very, very gripping. It's a very gripping book. It's very, very well written. Obviously, it's Stephen King. Most of his books are well written. Not all of them. Dreamcatcher. And it's very exciting. And it's not a particularly, I would say that it's not a particularly original premise, but it's very, very, very well executed. What I mean is, when I say premise, I mean, a killer, this idea that, the killer's abilities, when you realize what the killer can do, it's not, I would say, especially original, as with a lot of horror ideas. But it's very, very well executed and well worth a read. I do think it's one of his best recent offerings. So that's number 10. Number 9, we have 11/22/63. So this is a very interesting time travel story. There's always that old kind of discussion people have, if you could travel in time, would you go back in time and kill JFK? Would you go back in time and save Hitler? Maybe I got that the wrong way around. But anyway, that's, this is one of the things, would you go back in time and do this? Would you go back in time and do that? And the protagonist of our story here actually finds a means of traveling back into the past, into the year in which Kennedy was assassinated. And he finds himself in a position to perhaps change history. And basically, while the story is basically around that, it also contains a great many other themes as well. And I think it's a very, very human book. It's very, 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 very touching in places. It's very moving, and it's also pretty sad sometimes. It's also an interesting look on the question. It talks about we look at the idea of, if you could change the past, obviously that would change the future. And would that necessarily be a desirable thing? Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. We've got no way of knowing. But again, this is a superb read. It's a very, very thick book, as you can see there. It's a very thick book. But as King does sometimes get criticised for bloating his books out and going into unnecessary digressions, but I don't think that could be said here. Whilst it's a very, very thick book, I think it's deservedly so. I don't think there's really much or any filler in it. I found it to be a superb book. It works on a great many levels. I found that the time travel aspect was very, very intelligently explored. It's got compelling characters, and it just works on every level, in my opinion. Next up, we have Different Seasons. Different Seasons contains, I haven't read it for a while, so I've got to check up. Do excuse me. It contains 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I could have looked it up before the video. What are you going to do? 4 different short stories. One of them actually is the book from which The Shawshank Redemption with Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman was adapted from, Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. There's also another story called The Body, which I believe... No, excuse me, never mind. And there's also Apt Pupil. I think that was also adapted into a film as well, about a boy who comes across by chance an ex-Nazi commandant in hiding. So these 4 stories, I think, are very, very strong. If I had to say my favourite, it will probably be Apt Pupil. But all four stories work very, very well. As I say, Apt Pupil is my favourite, probably followed by The Shawshank Redemption, Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. A lot of people will probably have seen the movie. It's very similar to the movie. There are some digressions, but I think it's quite faithful. Obviously, it's Stephen King, so the book version is somewhat darker. I think that these four short stories, these 4 novellas, maybe you could call them, work very, very well. And I think that I don't think there are any weak stories in the bunch. I'm not giving a synopsis of each one, just the 2 most famous. But again, it's one of my favourite King books. Next, we come to a more recent book. We've got Billy Summers. Again, this is one of King's more recent works. Billy Summers follows an assassin, a somewhat unconventional assassin, because he likes to pretend to be less intelligent than he actually is. And he uses this very much in his favour. So it's a story about an assassin and him going to do a particular job. And it's very interesting because the setup is very clever. We get to see the assassin meticulously preparing for the hit. And we see the aftermath as well, which isn't as black and white as it might seem. In a typical kind of story like this, the assassin would do the hit and then go on the run, be pursued by the cops, and that would be that. This story is far, far more complex. This story doesn't really... It contains a very slight amount of supernatural stuff. But it's not particularly supernatural. But having said that, though, the characterization is very, very good. Billy Summers himself, the assassin, is very interesting. I think personally that the assassin is such a used trope in books, movies, TV series, and why not? Because assassins are interesting. But it's quite hard to do something new, quite hard to do something original with an assassin. And I think that Stephen King's approach here is actually very good. It's it also deals with his relationship with the girl whom he rescues after a particularly brutal incident. And it talks about the relationship between Billy Summers and this girl. I say girl because she's young enough to be his daughter, and Billy Summers is a man in middle age. And it's nice to see how this relationship develops and how they both navigate this relationship. I thought the ending was very powerful. I'm not going to spoil it for you, obviously, but I thought the ending was very powerful and very, very moving. And I would definitely recommend this. It's a very, very, very good read. Again, I found it to be a real barn burner. I didn't find there was any drag in it at all. I didn't think there was anything extraneous. It's highly recommended. Next up, we have Stephen King's, I believe, third book, The Shining. Now, this is a book that deserves its own review. It could also come under a great many other, it could come under a few other titles as well, like, top 10, top 5 haunted house books. Although in this case, we're talking about the Overlook Hotel. So this is Stephen King's third book. And in the introduction to this book, he makes it clear that he wanted to go a bit further in this one because he'd already written Carrie, he'd already written Salem's Lot, and they had both done extremely well. And they're both superb stories, they're both superb books. And he wanted to perhaps challenge himself more as a writer. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but he wanted to if I remember the foreword correctly, he wanted to kind of push himself a bit more. And this is a book that obviously it's a classic book. It's a horror book that can also appear on people's top 10, 100 books you need to read before you die. So I think it's got a wider crossover than a lot of horror books, than a lot of Stephen King's other books. Whether that's rightly so or not, I don't know, because Stephen King is a superb author anyway. But this is a book that is a classic, and rightly so. The Overlook Hotel is, in my opinion, a character in itself. I mean, it's not just the scene where the things happen. It's a character in itself, and it's full of this kind of brooding menace. It deals with a man called Jack Torrance who goes there who is hired as the caretaker over the winter. He goes there with his wife and his son, and slowly things start to unravel. And there's this whole thing about you start to see the hotel perhaps start to manifest certain things. There's the sense of, is the hotel haunted, or is it all in Jack's head? So it's kind of like a haunted hotel, it's kind of ghost story, but it also deals very much with other certain ideas as well. There's alcoholism, familial abuse. It's a deeper book than one might first think. It's not just a haunted hotel book or a haunted house book, but even as just a haunted house book, it works supremely well. It's his third book. I think a lot of people rank it as either his best or one of his best, and rightly so. Next up, we have a book, just a diversion. Do you like the way that I'm taking the books from the shelves back here? I mean, it's professional, isn't it, the way I got everything ready. Anyway, enough digressions. Here we've got Thinner. Now, if I'm not wrong, King wrote this originally under, well, I'm not wrong, it says written as Richard Bachman. He wrote it as Richard Bachman. But why did I say Bachman? Richard Bachman. I think it's one of his lesser known books. Certainly it's not celebrated in any way. And it's a thin book, no pun intended. And basically it's about a man who, on his way, he's a very corpulent man. And, he lives in a small town. And on his way back from a function in which he and his wife have maybe had a bit too much to drink, he hits an old gypsy woman. And thanks to the fact that he's friends with pretty much everyone who counts in the town, he's absolved of any responsibility for the gypsy woman's death because he kills her when he hits her with his car. This doesn't sit well really with the father of the gypsy woman, who is even older than she is. And unfortunately for the protagonist of the book, the antagonist of the protagonist, sorry, of the book, and the people who assisted him in getting off scot-free with the hit and run, the gypsy leader and the father of this woman has particular powers which unleashes on this hapless individual. So, as the title might suggest, he starts getting thinner. Okay, what's the problem with that, you might ask? Wouldn't we all like to be a bit thinner? Well, he starts to get thinner and thinner and thinner, and the process won't stop until he dies. So the book is basically about how he reacts to that and what he tries to do about it or what he does about it. So I found this book genuinely chilling because there's the revenge of the gypsy is pretty frightening. What he does to this man, making him waste away, is bad enough. But what he does to the other individuals who also cover up for him is, in my opinion, even worse. So the revenge this gypsy is capable of dishing out is, absolutely horrifying. And there's pretty much no way of defending yourself against it. So I found it chilling. It's as you can see, it's a short book. But it's again, it's very well written, and it's one of my favourite King books. I found it to be genuinely frightening. Next up, we have a book that I don't have a physical copy of, so you'll have to use your imagination. The Stand. So, of course, The Stand is one of King's early books as well. It's a real doorstopper of a book, and there are several versions of it. I think there's at least one or two versions there's at least one version where it contains material that was cut from the original. So The Stand, what is it basically about? Basically, there's a kind of superflu which sweeps the world, and it's extremely contagious and it's extremely fatal. I mean, I'm sure we can all relate because back in 2020, when COVID went viral, there was this dread that we were going to be hit with this killer plague that was going to wipe out society. Of course, it didn't. But I think it puts us all in a better position to appreciate a novel like The Stand. So basically, society is decimated, literally decimated. There's probably only about 10% of the population. No, not literally decimated. Society is pretty much annihilated. And from there, we see kind of a resurgence of good versus evil. It becomes very much a good versus evil story where people are drawn based on their inner nature, it would seem, to one camp or another. It's a superbly written book. I don't really want to give too much away. If I had to say a weak point, Flagg, I believe Randall Flagg is the name of the main antagonist, is in my opinion a bit of a naff protagonist. One of Stephen King's more boring bad guys, I think. But it's a very, very dense book. There's a lot happening in it, and it's well worth the read. It's a post-apocalyptic story, so obviously it's very, very dark in places. It's interesting when you follow how the superflu spreads, and it's interesting to see the various characters being drawn together throughout the novel, the good and the bad. So next up, we've got Night Shift. This is a collection of Stephen King short stories. I believe it's his best collection. Obviously, there are several, but this one contains the highest proportion of stories that I think I've enjoyed. This is the one, I've had it for well over 30 years. You can see it's really, really battered. But this is the one that I tend to go back to and reread. It's got my favourite short story, Stephen King short story of all time, One for the Road, which is a story which picks up sometime after the events of Salem's Lot. And I've always loved Salem's Lot. It's actually right back there, and that's my favourite Stephen King short story ever. But there are a lot of others in here as well that are very, very good. And I think that it's got I think it's got the highest percentage. It's got the highest hit rate for short stories. I think. So I would say the second one for me will be Skeleton Crew, but this has got some real, I think, classic Stephen King short stories, and several of these stories have actually been adapted for film. I mean, Sometimes They Come Back has been adapted for a film. Children of the Corn has been adapted. Let me see any others. Well, Quitters Inc. as well. Quitters Inc. was in the film Cat's Eye, where the guy tries to give up smoking. It stars James Woods. It's like a compendium of short stories in an overall arcing film, and Quitters Inc. is the first story in that film. So there are some classics in here. I think we've all probably heard of Children of the Corn. Don't know why I said that, corn. So it's a real classic. Next up, we've got The Running Man, with Arnold Schwarzenegger on the cover. I've already done a video on this, so if you haven't watched it, I suggest you go and watch that video. Okay, basically, it's in brief, it's basically a dystopian future. The world is falling apart. Everything's collapsing. The gulf between rich and poor is wider than ever. As I said in my video before, it's very much like the world today. So, yeah. And there's a most dangerous game, The Running Man. Only the best contestants are selected to participate. And until the events in this book, nobody has survived. They have to go 30 days with basically the whole nation looking out for them. There's a prize for anybody who can spot the running man. Actually, they're running men. They usually release two people at the same time. And basically, the running man has all the odds against him. It's kind of a lose-lose situation. But does the protagonist win? I won't spoil it for you. No. And then we've got Salem's Lot. This is my number one favourite Stephen King book. This version is the illustrated version. Okay, nice and hardback. Okay, Salem's Lot. It's basically Stephen, as I said in my top 5 vampire videos, my top 5 vampire books video. It's my number one vampire video book. It's an absolutely superb read. I'm not going to say too much about it. It's basically Stephen King's take on Count Dracula. It's Stephen King's second novel, and it's just incredibly good. I believe still it's one of his best works. Stephen King in general, in my opinion, did some of his best work early. That's not to downgrade all of the work he's done since then, just to say that I think some of his earliest work was his best work. So a vampire comes to a small town in Maine and shenanigans ensue. It's very, very Stephen King. What I think really works about this book is the fact that the vampires are so terrifying. I really do think that Stephen King's take on the vampires in Salem's Lot and the screen version with David Soul, the two-parter in the 1970s or not early 1980s, really capture vampires as they should be. Genuinely, absolutely terrifying. The Salem's Lot, I think, is the most. It's one of Stephen King. It's one of the most frightening horror books I've read, and I definitely think it's one of Stephen King's most frightening horror books as well. So if you haven't read it, I'd recommend you give it a try. I've kind of breezed through the reviews on each of these books because there are 10 of them, and I know that nobody by now will be watching this video anyway, so I don't want to bore people too much. So if you disagree with my list, please let me know. I know I committed sacrilege by not putting it on the list. Why wasn't it on the list? Because I put something else instead. Maybe on another day, it would be on this list. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any feedback, please let me know. And I will see you next time on the next video. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.